That voice belongs in a kitchen, not a boardroom. The words sliced through the 42nd floor conference room so sharply that even the quiet clicking of laptop keys stopped for half a second. A few executives laughed under their breath. One woman near the end of the marble table covered her smile with a coffee cup. Daniel Mercer leaned back in his leather chair, adjusting the silver cufflink on his sleeve like he had just delivered the perfect joke. Outside the glass walls, rain rolled down the skyline of downtown Chicago in slow gray streaks, blurring the city lights beneath the storm clouds gathering over Lake Michigan. Naomi Brooks lowered her eyes and kept moving the mop across the polished floor beside the conference table. The faint scent of lemon cleaner mixed with expensive cologne and burnt espresso hung heavy in the cold air-conditioned room. Her faded navy janitor uniform looked almost black beneath the recessed ceiling lights, and the plastic ID badge clipped near her shoulder swung softly every time she pushed the mop forward. Daniel watched her for another second before shaking his head with amusement. "I'm serious," he told the room. "You walk into a billion-dollar negotiation sounding like that. People stop hearing your ideas." More laughter. Naomi's hand tightened around the mop handle, but her face stayed calm. Earlier that morning, she had been speaking to her mother on the phone near the service elevator, her warm Louisiana accent spilling naturally into the hallway while she reminded her to take medication before the home nurse arrived. She hadn't realized Daniel Mercer himself was walking past at that exact moment. Now the memory hung over the room like smoke nobody wanted to acknowledge. Naomi dipped the mop into the bucket again, the wheels squeaking softly against the marble floor. The giant presentation screen at the front of the room displayed the logo for Gulf Dominion Energy beside Mercer Global Technologies. $400 million sat on that screen. $400 million Daniel Mercer planned to secure before sunrise in Dubai 12 hours later through a live international negotiation. Executives shuffled through, binders thick with contracts and projections while assistants rushed around refilling coffee and checking wireless headsets. Nobody looked directly at Naomi anymore, but she could feel their eyes avoiding her, the way people did after somebody powerful embarrassed you publicly. Daniel stood and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the storm-dark city. His reflection stretched across the glass, sharp and expensive. "Perception matters," he continued confidently. "People trust authority when it sounds polished." Naomi slowly lifted the yellow caution sign near the wet floor and turned toward the hallway. But before she reached the door, one of the translators suddenly spoke through the speakerphone connected to Dubai. His voice stumbled. Confused Arabic spilled awkwardly into English. On the monitor, the lead Gulf Dominion executive frowned instantly. Another man beside him whispered something sharply off camera. The energy in the room shifted. Fast. Daniel's smile faded just slightly. Naomi stopped walking. Her eyes moved toward the speaker. Then her expression changed. Not offended. Not angry. Concerned. The room did not collapse all at once. It happened slowly, like ice cracking beneath expensive shoes. The translator cleared his throat again through the speaker system, nervously repeating the sentence in English, while the men on the Dubai screen exchanged colder and colder expressions. One executive inside Mercer Global shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Another loosened his tie. Daniel Mercer remained standing near the window, but the confidence in his posture had changed. Smaller now. Sharper. "Tell them the clause guarantees flexibility," Daniel ordered impatiently. The translator obeyed immediately, his voice shaky. The moment the sentence reached the other side of the call, the oldest Gulf Dominion executive leaned back in visible offense. He spoke rapidly in Arabic, his deep voice echoing through the surround speakers mounted in the ceiling. Nobody in Chicago understood him except Naomi. Her hand froze on the mop handle. Rain tapped steadily against the glass walls behind her, while the city glowed silver beneath the storm clouds. She listened carefully, eyes narrowing slightly. The translator was making it worse. Much worse. Naomi slowly looked toward the conference table where stacks of legal documents sat open beside half-empty espresso cups and glowing tablets. She knew that tone. She knew the subtle shift in phrasing. Gulf Dominion no longer believed this was a partnership discussion. They believed they were being cornered. Daniel walked back toward the table, jaw tight. "What did he say?" he demanded. The translator hesitated. "He said they are reconsidering some conditions." Naomi quietly exhaled through her nose. That was not what the man had said. Not even close. The executive in Dubai had actually accused Mercer Global of disguising control as cooperation. A dangerous insult in a negotiation built on honor and status. Naomi glanced toward the screen again. The older executive now sat perfectly still, fingers folded in front of him. That silence worried her more than yelling would have. Across the room, two assistants hurried to refill water glasses nobody was touching anymore. The smell of burnt coffee lingered beneath the cold, recycled air. Daniel rubbed his temple. We cannot lose this deal over translation issues. Nobody answered him. Because everyone in the room suddenly understood the truth. They already were. Naomi looked down at the yellow gloves covering her hands. For a moment she told herself to stay quiet. Finish the floor. Leave through the service elevator. Go home to her mother's apartment on the south side before the rain turned into another overnight storm warning. That was the safe choice. Invisible people survived by staying invisible. But then the speaker system crackled again. Another sentence in Arabic. Sharper this time. More direct. Naomi's eyes widened slightly. One of the Gulf Dominion executives had just suggested postponing the agreement indefinitely. Daniel looked toward the translator again. Well, the man swallowed hard. Sweat darkened the collar of his white dress shirt. He says they may need more review. Naomi closed her eyes for half a second. No, that was not what he said either. The room felt colder suddenly. The giant city skyline behind the windows blurred beneath sheets of rain while thunder rolled somewhere far above Lake Michigan. Naomi opened her eyes again and looked toward Daniel Mercer. He still did not notice the disaster unfolding directly in front of him. Slowly, carefully, she set the mop against the wall. Then she spoke. Sir, she said softly, her Louisiana accent warm and steady in the frozen room. That is not what they are saying at all. The room went completely still after Naomi spoke. Not quiet. Still. The kind of stillness that makes people suddenly aware of the hum inside the ceiling vents and the rain sliding down glass 42 floors above the street. Daniel Mercer turned slowly toward her, disbelief hardening across his face. For a second, nobody moved. Naomi stood beside the wall with her yellow cleaning gloves still on, the mop bucket beside her reflecting silver light from the city skyline outside. The translator looked relieved and offended at the same time. One executive near the center of the table gave a nervous laugh. Excuse me, Daniel asked finally, his voice low and sharp. Naomi kept her tone calm. The gentleman on the left did not say they needed more review. Daniel stared at her. Then what did he say? Naomi hesitated only briefly. She knew every eye in the room was already judging her before she opened her mouth again. A cleaner interrupting executives during a $400 million negotiation was not bravery in a place like this. It was career suicide. But the damage was already happening. He said your team is treating partnership language like ownership language. Naomi answered carefully. They believe the translation sounds disrespectful. Across the giant monitor, the older Gulf Dominion executive narrowed his eyes slightly. He had understood her English immediately. Daniel folded his arms. And how exactly would you know that? Naomi glanced toward the screen again. Because the translator keeps confusing honor-based phrasing with transactional phrasing. The translator's face turned red instantly. That is not true. Naomi ignored him. In Gulf negotiations, wording matters more than numbers sometimes. The phrase he used sounded like surrender terms, not cooperation. A few executives exchanged uneasy looks. One woman slowly lowered her tablet onto the table. Daniel took another step toward Naomi, expensive shoes tapping softly against marble. You are telling me our certified translator is wrong? Naomi did not back away. I am saying they are becoming insulted. Thunder rolled somewhere outside the building, deep and distant. The city lights flickered against the rain-streaked windows. Daniel studied her silently now, his jaw tightening harder with every second. He was not a man used to being corrected publicly, especially not by someone holding a mop. This is exactly the problem with people who overhear half a conversation, he said coldly. They think confidence equals expertise. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. Sir, with respect, they are preparing to walk away. The moment she finished speaking, the oldest executive on the Dubai screen suddenly said something firm in Arabic and closed his folder. One of the other men beside him reached for the conference microphone. The translator panicked and rushed to speak over them, but his words stumbled badly. Daniel's chief legal officer sat upright immediately. "Wait," she whispered. "Why are they closing documents?" Nobody answered her. Naomi already knew why. The negotiation was collapsing in real time. Daniel looked back toward the screen, irritation slowly giving way to uncertainty. The Gulf Dominion executive spoke again, this time slower, sharper, every syllable heavy with controlled offense. Naomi felt her stomach tighten. Then she heard the sentence that changed everything. Her eyes widened slightly before she could stop herself. Daniel noticed. "What now?" he demanded. Naomi looked directly at him for the first time since entering the room that night. Her voice remained soft, but the warning inside it landed like cold steel. "Sir," she said carefully, "he just asked whether your company understands the difference between respect and control." No one spoke after Naomi finished that sentence. The rain outside grew heavier, streaking the giant windows in restless silver lines while thunder rolled low across the Chicago skyline. Daniel Mercer stood motionless beside the conference table, his expression caught somewhere between irritation and disbelief. The executives around him looked uncomfortable now, shifting in leather chairs, avoiding eye contact with both Naomi and the massive screen displaying Gulf Dominion's boardroom in Dubai. On the monitor, the older executive adjusted the cuff of his white robe slowly, deliberately, then spoke again in Arabic. This time the translator hesitated too long before answering. Naomi immediately knew why. He did not understand the phrasing anymore. Panic had started clouding his listening. Daniel noticed it too. "Translate," he snapped sharply. The translator swallowed hard and stumbled through another weak interpretation about delaying legal alignment and reassessing timelines. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. Wrong again. Completely wrong. She could almost feel the temperature inside the room dropping. One Gulf Dominion advisor leaned sideways and whispered into the older executive's ear, while another quietly closed his tablet altogether. Tiny movements. Silent movements. But Naomi had spent years around negotiations where deals lived or died inside details smaller than breathing. Daniel turned toward his legal team. "Can somebody explain why this suddenly feels like a funeral?" Nobody answered him. Because deep down they already understood. They were losing control. Naomi slowly stepped closer to the edge of the conference table, careful, measured, like someone approaching a ledge in the dark. "Sir," she said quietly, "they are not talking about timelines anymore." Daniel looked at her sharply. "Then what are they talking about?" Naomi glanced toward the monitor again. "Honor." The word landed heavily in the room. One executive scoffed nervously under his breath, but Daniel did not laugh this time. Naomi continued carefully. "The translator keeps using transactional language. Gulf Dominion does not see this deal as a purchase. They see it as a relationship agreement between families and reputation." Daniel folded his arms tighter. "This is business, not poetry." Naomi nodded softly. "To them, it is both." Silence followed immediately after. The older executive on the monitor suddenly spoke directly toward the camera, his deep voice controlled but unmistakably offended. Naomi listened closely. Then her stomach sank. The translator froze completely this time. Sweat rolled visibly along his temple. "Translate him," Daniel ordered again. The man opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Naomi knew why. Because the Gulf Dominion executive had just accused Mercer Global of disguising dominance as cooperation. That accusation could destroy the deal permanently if answered wrong. Daniel took one frustrated step toward the monitor. "What did he say?" Naomi looked down briefly at the yellow gloves still covering her hands. Then she answered. "He said trust cannot exist where respect does not." The room went dead silent again. Even the executives who had laughed earlier now stared at her without moving. Daniel's jaw tightened hard enough to show beneath the soft conference lighting. "And you know this because what? You took an online language course between cleaning floors." A few nervous chuckles escaped around the table, but they died quickly. Naomi remained calm. "No, sir." Daniel stepped closer. "Then explain to me why my translator suddenly looks terrified and my negotiation is falling apart because of a janitor with opinions." Naomi finally lifted her eyes fully to his. There was no anger in her face, only certainty. "Because your translator understands words," she said quietly. "But he does not understand the people speaking them." Before Daniel could answer, The older Gulf Dominion executive suddenly leaned toward the camera, studying Naomi carefully from thousands of miles away. Then, in perfect English, he asked one simple question that made the entire room freeze. "Who," he said slowly, "is the woman standing beside the wall?" The question hung in the conference room like smoke after a fire. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for their coffee anymore. Rain hammered harder against the towering windows while the city lights below shimmered beneath the storm like blurred gold underwater. Daniel Mercer looked from the screen to Naomi and back again, confusion flickering across his face for the first time all night. The older Gulf Dominion executive continued studying Naomi carefully through the monitor, his expression unreadable now. Naomi stood near the wall beside the yellow mop bucket, her cleaning gloves still damp, her pulse beginning to pound beneath the calm expression she fought to maintain. One of Daniel's executives leaned toward him nervously. Why is he focused on her? Daniel ignored the question. She is part of the cleaning staff, he answered toward the screen, his voice clipped and controlled. The Gulf Dominion executive did not respond immediately. Instead, he leaned closer to the camera. The soft light from Dubai reflected against the silver in his beard while the room behind him remained perfectly silent. "Interesting," he said at last. Daniel forced a tight smile. "We apologize for the interruption. We can continue now." But the executive was no longer looking at Daniel. His eyes remained fixed on Naomi. "What is your name?" he asked her directly. Every head in the room turned toward her again. Naomi hesitated. She could feel Daniel's irritation burning beside her like heat from an open oven. "Naomi Brooks, sir," she answered softly. The executive repeated the name under his breath once. Slowly, carefully, as though testing an old memory. Then something subtle changed in his expression. Not shock yet. Recognition beginning to wake up. Daniel noticed it immediately. "Sir, with respect, she is not involved in these negotiations." The older executive finally looked back at Daniel. "Clearly," he replied calmly. "That may be the problem." A sharp silence followed. Daniel's legal team shifted uneasily. The translator stared down at the table now, avoiding everyone's eyes completely. Naomi felt the room tightening around her, the pressure building inside the cold conference air. She should not have spoken. She knew that. People in her position were not supposed to interrupt men like Daniel Mercer. They were supposed to disappear into the background beside elevators and supply closets and polished floors. But the deal was unraveling too fast to ignore. The Gulf Dominion executive spoke again suddenly, this time in Arabic. Fast, layered, complex. The translator froze completely. Naomi understood every word instantly. The executive was asking whether Mercer Global truly believed leadership could exist without humility. Daniel looked impatient now. "Translate him." "Nothing." The translator could barely breathe. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. Then she answered before she could stop herself. In fluent Arabic, the words flowed out low and smooth, warm with the soft rhythm of someone who had not spoken the language in years but still carried it deep in memory. The room exploded into stunned silence. One executive nearly dropped his pen. Another slowly removed his glasses as though he suddenly could not trust his own hearing. Daniel turned toward Naomi, so sharply his chair bumped against the edge of the table. Across the screen, every Gulf Dominion executive sat upright instantly. The older man stared at Naomi without blinking now. Naomi finished translating calmly, then added one respectful sentence of her own in Arabic. The older executive's eyes widened slightly. Then he stood up from his chair. Slowly, deliberately. The movement alone sent panic through Daniel's legal team because nobody could tell whether the man was offended or impressed. The executive stepped closer to the camera, studying Naomi with disbelief growing visibly across his face. Then, in perfect English, he spoke words that drained all color from Daniel Mercer's face. "Naomi Brooks," he said quietly, "you trained my negotiation division in Doha 7 years ago." For several seconds, nobody in the conference room breathed loudly enough to hear. The rain against the windows softened into a steady hiss, while the lights of downtown Chicago shimmered through the storm like distant stars beneath water. Daniel Mercer stood frozen beside the conference table, one hand resting against the back of his leather chair as though he suddenly needed something solid to hold on to. Across the massive screen, the executives in Dubai were no longer watching him. Every eye remained fixed on Naomi Brooks. The older Gulf Dominion executive stepped closer to the camera slowly, disbelief still visible across his face. "You disappeared," he said quietly. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment. "Life changed, sir." His expression softened immediately. "You taught our senior division how to negotiate through cultural conflict without humiliation." Around Daniel, several executives exchanged stunned looks. One woman near the far end of the table whispered under her breath, "My God." The translator sat motionless now, his headset hanging loose around his neck like dead weight. Daniel finally found his voice again. "You know each other?" The older executive turned toward him calmly. 7 years ago, Naomi Brooks trained 43 executives in Doha after a merger nearly collapsed because American consultants could not understand regional negotiation customs. He paused briefly. "She prevented a billion-dollar failure." The silence afterward felt enormous. Naomi stood beside the mop bucket in her faded Navy uniform while the room struggled to process the difference between what they thought they were seeing and what was actually standing in front of them. Daniel looked at Naomi carefully now, really looking for the first time all night. The yellow gloves, the worn shoes, the service badge clipped beside her shoulder. Nothing about her matched the image in his mind of someone powerful. And yet somehow every powerful person in the room had suddenly begun listening to her instead of him. Thunder rolled again outside the building, lower this time, farther away. Naomi quietly removed one cleaning glove and folded it into her hand. "I did not mean to interrupt your negotiation," she said softly. The Gulf Dominion executive gave a small smile. "You did not interrupt it," he replied. "You saved it." Daniel looked down briefly, jaw tightening hard. Earlier that evening he had laughed at her accent in front of his entire executive team. Now the same voice had become the only thing standing between Mercer Global and disaster. Naomi could feel the room shifting around her, the invisible hierarchy changing shape in real time. The executives who ignored her before were now studying her carefully, almost cautiously. One assistant quietly pushed aside the mop bucket to clear space near the table without even realizing she had done it. Small things. Human things. Naomi noticed all of them. The older executive in Dubai leaned back slowly into his chair. "Miss Brooks," he said, "if you are willing, I would prefer to continue this negotiation with your assistance." Daniel's eyes widened slightly. The request hit the room harder than shouting would have. Naomi hesitated. She had spent the last 3 years cleaning offices at night, caring for her mother during the day, trying to survive quietly enough that nobody noticed how far she had fallen from the world she once belonged to. Now that same world was staring directly at her again beneath cold conference lights and rain-covered glass. Daniel finally spoke, but the arrogance in his voice was gone now. Only uncertainty remained. "Naomi," he said carefully, "would you be willing to help us continue?" Naomi looked toward the skyline beyond the giant windows. The storm was beginning to pass slowly over Lake Michigan, leaving silver light breaking through the clouds far in the distance. Then she looked back at the table where powerful people sat waiting for her answer. "Only if we begin again," she said quietly, this time with respect. No one objected when Naomi walked toward the conference table. Not Daniel Mercer, not the legal team, not even the executives who had laughed at her less than an hour earlier. The only sound in the room came from the rain easing gently against the windows and the soft hum of electronics beneath the recessed ceiling lights. Naomi removed her second glove slowly and placed both yellow gloves neatly beside the mop bucket near the wall. Then she stepped forward in worn black shoes that squeaked faintly against the polished marble floor. The movement felt small, but every person in the room watched it like history changing direction by inches. Daniel pulled out the chair beside him awkwardly, uncertain whether to speak first or stay silent. Naomi thanked him quietly and sat down at the table where nobody had imagined she belonged. Across the massive screen, the Gulf Dominion executives straightened visibly. Their posture changed immediately, the tension inside the Dubai boardroom easing for the first time all night. The older executive gave a respectful nod. "It is good to see you again, Miss Brooks." Naomi returned the gesture softly. "You as well, sir." Daniel looked between them carefully, still trying to understand how a woman cleaning his office floors had suddenly become the most important person in the negotiation. Naomi opened the contract binder sitting nearest to her. Her fingers moved calmly across the pages, scanning paragraphs with practiced precision. The room watched in silence. Then she spoke in Arabic again, low and fluent, her Louisiana warmth blending naturally into the measured cadence of international negotiation language. The effect was immediate. Faces on the Dubai screen softened. One executive even smiled faintly for the first time since the meeting began. Naomi addressed the earlier misunderstanding directly, carefully reframing Mercer Global's position without humiliation or defensiveness. She did not erase the offense. She acknowledged it respectfully. That difference changed everything. Daniel could actually feel control returning to the room, not through pressure or dominance, but through trust rebuilding itself sentence by sentence. Naomi listened more than she spoke. When the Gulf Dominion executives raised concerns about authority clauses, she translated not just the words but the emotional meaning beneath them. They are worried the agreement sounds one-sided after implementation, she explained quietly to Daniel's team. Not because they distrust the numbers, because they distrust imbalance. Daniel nodded slowly now, absorbing every word. The same accent he mocked earlier suddenly sounded calm, intelligent, steady, human. Naomi turned another page in the contract. Section 14 needs different phrasing, she said. The language implies unilateral adjustment authority. The legal team quickly revised the wording while Naomi continued speaking with the Dubai executives in Arabic. The atmosphere transformed gradually. Water glasses were touched again. Pens moved. Tablets reopened. The suffocating tension that once filled the room loosened inch by inch beneath Naomi's guidance. Daniel sat beside her almost silently now, watching her navigate the negotiation with effortless precision. Not flashy, not theatrical, just deeply skilled. At one point, the older Gulf Dominion executive leaned back with a faint smile and said something in Arabic that made Naomi laugh softly under her breath. Daniel looked confused. What did he say? Naomi glanced toward him briefly. He said negotiations fail when pride becomes louder than listening. Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment. The sentence hit harder than any public embarrassment could have. Hours earlier, he had dismissed Naomi because of the way her voice sounded in a hallway phone call. Now that same voice was saving the largest deal of his career. The storm outside finally began breaking apart over Chicago, pale silver moonlight pushing through gaps in the clouds while the city below slowly brightened beneath the wet streets. Inside the conference room, the agreement that once seemed destroyed was quietly coming back to life. By the time the final revisions were approved, the storm over Chicago had almost completely passed. The rain had faded into scattered droplets sliding lazily down the glass walls, while pale moonlight reflected across the wet streets below like silver ribbons. Inside the conference room, exhaustion mixed with disbelief. Mercer Global's legal team sat quietly reviewing signatures while the Gulf Dominion executives exchanged calm conversation on the giant screen for the first time that night. The suffocating tension was gone. In its place sat something rarer in rooms filled with money and ego. Respect. Naomi closed the final contract binder gently and slid it toward Daniel Mercer. The partnership language now reflects mutual authority, she said softly. Daniel looked at the document for a long moment before nodding. Thank you. The words sounded unfamiliar coming from him, almost heavy in his throat. Across the screen, the older Gulf Dominion executive smiled faintly. Miss Brooks, he said warmly, it seems the world has wasted your talents long enough. Naomi lowered her eyes modestly. Sometimes life changes direction without asking permission. The executive nodded slowly like a man who understood exactly what she meant. One by one, the Dubai executives stood and offered respectful farewells before disconnecting from the call. The giant monitor faded black, leaving only the reflection of the Chicago skyline floating across the dark screen. Silence settled over the room again, but this silence felt different now. Softer, human. Executives began gathering papers quietly, speaking in lowered voices. Some glanced toward Naomi with awkward curiosity, others with visible admiration. The same people who had ignored her mop bucket an hour earlier now stepped carefully around it, as though it suddenly carried meaning. Naomi stood slowly from the conference table and reached for her yellow cleaning gloves near the wall. Daniel watched her the entire time. He could not stop replaying his own words from earlier in the evening. That voice belongs in a kitchen, not a boardroom. The memory sat inside his chest like broken glass now. Naomi slipped one glove on calmly, preparing to return to the work she had been doing before anyone remembered she existed. Daniel finally spoke. Naomi. She paused, but did not turn immediately. The room behind them had mostly emptied now, leaving only the faint sound of printers humming somewhere beyond the hallway and the distant rumble of traffic below 42 stories of glass and steel. Daniel walked toward her slowly. Without the crowd around him, he looked older somehow, less polished. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. Naomi faced him then, her expression calm but unreadable. Daniel glanced down briefly before continuing. I judged you before I knew anything about you. Naomi said nothing. Daniel exhaled slowly. I heard your accent and decided what you were worth. The honesty in his voice surprised even him. Naomi studied him for a moment beneath the cold conference lights. Then she looked toward the rain-speckled skyline outside the windows. Most people do, she answered softly. Daniel swallowed hard. How are you standing here helping me after the way I treated you tonight? Naomi slipped on her second glove carefully before answering. Because bitterness costs too much, she said. And I already spent enough years losing things. Daniel lowered his eyes again, unable to respond immediately. The city lights shimmered behind Naomi while moonlight reflected softly across the marble floor around her worn black shoes and yellow cleaning bucket. For the first time in years, Daniel Mercer felt genuinely ashamed of the way he had measured people. Not by character, not by wisdom, but by polish, by image, by sound. Naomi reached for the mop handle again, but before she could leave, Daniel spoke one more time. You should not be cleaning offices at midnight. Naomi gave the faintest smile. Maybe not, she said quietly. But tonight, somebody had to clean up the mess. 3 weeks later, the rain was gone from Chicago. Morning sunlight spilled across the glass towers downtown, turning the streets below into ribbons of gold and silver beneath the rush of traffic and steaming coffee carts on the sidewalks. Mercer Global's headquarters looked exactly the same from the outside. 42 stories of steel and polished glass rising above the city skyline. But inside, something had shifted permanently. People moved differently now, softer around each other, more aware. Daniel Mercer stood alone inside the conference room where the negotiation had nearly collapsed. The giant marble table reflected pale sunlight across untouched coffee cups and neatly stacked reports, while the city glowed bright beyond the windows overlooking Lake Michigan. He loosened his tie slowly and looked toward the far corner near the service hallway where a yellow mop bucket had once stood beneath cold fluorescent lights. Strange how a room could remember shame long after the moment passed. A quiet knock came at the open door. Daniel turned. Naomi Brooks stepped inside carrying a slim leather portfolio against her side. No janitor uniform. No cleaning gloves. She wore a dark navy blazer now, simple but elegant, her natural curls pinned softly behind her shoulders. Yet somehow the biggest difference was not the clothes. It was the way people looked at her when she walked through the building. Heads no longer turned with dismissal. Doors opened before she reached them. Voices lowered respectfully when she spoke. Daniel noticed all of it. Naomi crossed the conference room, calmly while sunlight reflected across the polished floor beneath her heels. The revised Gulf Dominion schedule arrived this morning, she said warmly, setting the portfolio on the table. Her Louisiana accent still wrapped gently around every word, unchanged, unhidden. Daniel almost smiled hearing it now. Funny how the same voice he once mocked had become the most trusted sound inside the company. Naomi opened the portfolio and reviewed several documents while Daniel quietly watched her work. Efficient, focused, grounded. Not once had success made her arrogant. If anything, it had made her gentler. That unsettled